don't tend to stick to you after time. Places tend to do the same as we do. This river carries on and on.
Welcome to another episode with the Kankakee County Museum. We sit down with members of the Kankakee County Museum once a month to go over something historical in our county's history. Before I welcome Jack Clacy back onto the podcast, just want to mention some museum events that are coming up. We have Bastille Day that's coming up on July 14th that will be celebrated. And the 14th Annual Artisan Fair, which is November 2nd at the Kankakee County Museum. And as always, the annual Gallery of Trees. This will be the 46th year. That's December 3rd or December 7th through the 30th. And there's going to be more events that come about throughout the year. But those are just kind of like some main events that we schedule every single year at the museum. So if you ever want to learn more about either the French Heritage Museum, Kankakee County Museum, you can always go to kankakeecountymuseum.com, and better yet, just go visit one of the campuses today, dive into our county's history, and I'm sure you'll find at least one, if not more, things fascinating about our county's history. Today, we're celebrating Memorial Day, Jack.
That's
Welcome
right.
back.
Oh, always happy to be here.
Yeah.
I think that this is one of those enjoyable things we do every month.
It is. And I think if I remember correctly, I think this is the first time we've actually done something to celebrate Memorial Day with the museum.
I think so. Yeah.
And why not? Because one of the biggest parts of the museum is there's a lot of veteran history,
Right.
war history at the museum. So,
Yeah, we have a good-sized gallery devoted strictly to the military, all the wars that we've been in, of course, one way or another, from the Revolution up all the way through the Middle Eastern things. So,
and it doesn't even include all the things in the back, all the artifacts in the back room. I've seen some
thousands.
Yeah, but there's so much pertaining to veterans or wars or anything like that, military related in the back room too. And I know you guys try to swap those things out sometimes and do some special exhibits. But there's one of the biggest things that has stuck out to me in the war section of the Kankakee County Museum is the USS Kankakee.
Right.
So believe it or not, once upon a time, there was a ship named after us in the U.S. Navy.
Yes, it is. World War II.
Okay, so
actually, we have on display in that gallery the huge wooden official ship's wheel from.
I wondered if that was actually from the ship.
It is. It is.
It is.
And of course, at that time in the 40s, that was not. That was used strictly as an emergency steering device. The rest of it was done mechanically out of a different part of the ship. But that was the fallback. But typically, the ship's wheel has always been kind of a symbol of the Navy and of individual ships. So
oh, yeah, absolutely.
It was given to us by the USS Kankakee Association, which was an organization of men who had been members of the crew or officers on the ship through its period of existence. And when they had reached the point where their membership, due to aging and so forth, dropped to a point where it was no longer viable, they gathered up all the material they had, including the wheel, the logbooks, and any pictures and any number of other items relating to the USS Kankakee, and called us up and say, "Would you like these for your museum?" And we said, "Uh-huh."
Yes, please.
Yes, we would, please. And so we have that's on, and so we have a lot of material on that and many other topics. You mentioned what was in the back. Most museums, if they're properly organized and so forth, probably display 10% or less of their collection at any given time because we rotate through, or the things are there strictly for research and so forth. But getting to today's topic.
Yeah, I mean, how in the world did we get a ship named after us?
Okay, I'll tell you. For one thing, the AO-39, which was the official designation of the ship, the USS Kankakee, was a member of the Kennebec class of fleet oilers, basically floating gas stations or tankers. The Kennebec class was named for American rivers with a Native American origin, and their names are Native American origin. And there, I believe, 6 that were in World War II that were named, that were part of the Kennebec class. The Kennebec, Merrimack, Winooski, Lackawanna, Neosho, and, of course, Kankakee.
Wow.
This is a pretty good-sized operation. Show a picture here. This is the Kankakee, USS Kankakee. I think in this particular case, somewhere in the Mediterranean, but I'm not sure. In probably the 50s or so, because it was around for quite a few years. You can see it's hard to tell from this, but it actually is a pretty good-sized ship. It was 501 feet long.
That's a good size.
Which is about 1.5 base football fields.
Yeah, no big deal.
And but it was narrower than a football field. It was 68 feet wide as opposed to 160 feet in a football field. But and as I said, it was a floating gas station. It had a cargo capacity of 130,000 barrels of oil or gasoline, or sometimes a mix of 2 in different holds and so forth, which works out to 4,095,000 gallons.
Oh my gosh!
An awful lot of gas.
So were they providing fuel for other ships, or was it also planes as well, or just any military vehicle? Or?
No, the fleet oilers actually generally were part of a task force or a group of ships, and they were the refueling device for a carrier, let's say, that was in that group. They would deal with them. And they also, since they carried avgas as well, they also would replenish the supply of aviation gas for the aircraft aboard that carrier. And then, it works its way down through the different ships in the unit, but everything from destroyers on upward to the battleships.
To the submarines?
I don't know about that.
Submarines?
Probably so, if they were able to surface and put the hose in or whatever they did.
Yeah, I always wondered. Although those submarines had like the nuclear reactors.
Later were the nuclear reactors, but previous to that, World War II, they were diesel powered.
Oh, they were. Okay, gotcha.
Anyway, the USS Kankakee was. We'll get to the history of that in a little while. I want to mention something else that some people in Kankakee may remember. On April 1, 1955, there's the front page of the Journal, the Daily Journal at that time. It's not very clear on this, but down here in this corner, there's an illustration and a little cut line. And I'll show you now what the illustration looked like. This is the USS Kankakee moored in the Kankakee River down below the dam. And I'll read you the caption line from the story.
You said this was 1956?
1955. April 1, 1955. Remember that date's important.
Yes, that's very important.
Okay, and the caption line for this picture, that a good day for a tour on the USS Kankakee. Moored in the Kankakee River today, just downstream from the Public Service Company Dam, is the Navy oiler USS Kankakee. Hauled overland on a large trailer, the ship was brought here to give local residents a look at the craft named after their town. Incorrect, but they're
right. Yeah, we know that.
Guided tours through the ship are offered this evening only. Tomorrow it will leave for the Atlantic Ocean. On the return trip, the Kankakee will be slung beneath a large helicopter. This special April 1 public event was arranged by the Kankakee Daily Journal. A lot of people got suckered on that.
Was there a line?
No.
No?
Yes, there was a traffic jam on the Washington Avenue Bridge.
Because of that story?
Because of this, people coming to see it and see about whether they could take a tour.
Please tell me the Journal took pictures of that.
I haven't seen any recording of it.
If it was me, if I was the person doing that story, I would have made sure to have taken the pictures of the traffic and then published that story the next day. Citizens fall for April Fool's story. Traffic jam on bridge.
One of the people who fall for it was the Journal's general manager.
No, they didn't tell the GM?
Brought his kids down there to take the tour.
Oh, my
No,
gosh.
it was a very tightly kept secret. Only people in the editorial department, including, I believe, Armand Korstick, who was the chief photographer for the Journal at that time, and he's the one who created this picture, which by today's Photoshop standards is pretty crude.
I was just going to say, I mean, if that's 1955 Photoshop, that's pretty good.
Yeah, because considering there was no 1955 Photoshop.
There was not.
What Armand did was he had, in fact, a photo very similar to the one I had before. I've seen it, and carefully cut it out and pasted it onto a picture of the dam and the icy bridge. Even though it was rather crude, and he lettered in USS Kankakee on the bow, which, of course, you'd never have the name of the ship at that point on a naval vessel. You had AO-39, which was its designation.
Oh, okay. But I didn't realize that.
But the obviously, for one thing, perspective problems. I'm not quite sure how wide the river is at that point, but I don't think it's 500 feet across.
No, I was
so it'd be a little problem floating the boat on there, especially since the depth of water below the dam in most cases is only a couple feet.
Yeah, and I was looking at the height of the bridge compared to the height of the ship, and it's much smaller. So.
This was the first of a long series of April Fool stories in the Journal.
That was a question I was going to ask you, if this one kicked it off.
Yeah, that's a long-standing tradition in journalism through a lot of papers. It's kind of died out now.
Yeah, because I don't even know if the Journal did one this last year, or even the last couple
I did.
Years. You did?
My column for April 1st was an April Fool column about find of a huge bones and so forth beneath the foundation of the courthouse when they were tearing down at 1909 the courthouse to build the current one. And it had not been done for a few years. I got a few people calling and saying, "Oh, groan."
Getting back to the U.S. Kankakee.
Yes.
So was the ship created, was the ship created out of need for ships for the war, or was the ship made before the war?
Originally, it was. Let's see here. Built at the Sparrows Point Shipyard in Maryland, and was launched on January 24th, 1942. And at that time, it was being built as a privately owned tanker for Saucony Mobile or something like that.
Oh.
However, 3 months later, it was acquired by the U.S. Navy on March 31, 1942. And I don't remember what the name that had been given to it when it was privately built, but it was commissioned as the USS Kankakee on May 4th of 1942. And, of course, we were deep into the war already.
Yeah, and I imagine at that point, they were probably trying to acquire ships that were already built.
Yes.
So they could easily get them out.
I think, in fact, all 6 of the ships in the Kennebunk class were pretty much absorbed into the Navy at the same time. They were all about the same age and built on the same platform.
Okay.
The USS Kankakee's first voyage as a naval. By the way, something that might be of interest in here. Just mentioned that the staffing. There were 19 officers and 242 enlisted men.
That's quite a bit.
Oh, a good size. It was a good size ship.
Yeah.
And these were all men. This is before the Navy had
women.
Later on, of course, the Waves were founded, but I think that was not until 1943, if I remember correctly. Anyway, first voyage for the USS Kankakee, they left Norfolk, Virginia on June 1, 1942, went down the East Coast, went through the Panama Canal, up the other side of the country along California, and all the way to San Francisco to deliver a cargo of fuel oil. After that, they kept real busy.
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
From 42 to 45, they were mostly in the Pacific theater of operations. I guess since they were there already in San Francisco, they said, and there was, of course, a very hot war going on.
Well, that's where the bulk of the naval activity was in the Pacific.
That's correct, yeah. And they were involved in war operations of the Solomon Islands, Western Carolines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who later became Chief of Naval Operations for the Navy, commended the Kankakee, USS Kankakee, as the most efficient tanker we have met. So that was a point of pride, I'm sure, for all the sailors who were involved in it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
From 46 to 55, they served in the Mediterranean and Pacific assignments, and they kind of shuttled all over the place, just wherever they were needed. Of course, those were pretty quiet years comparatively. We began to get into the Korean War, of course, later toward the end of that. But in 1955, they were decommissioned and placed in a reserve fleet. Apparently, they had more ships of that category than they needed for a while. But that only lasted for, I think, about a year because they were pulled out of the reserve fleet and recommissioned and served in the Atlantic for a time, and then again were decommissioned and put back in the reserve for a while in November of 57. They spent about 5 years in the reserves. In October 1962, there was this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
So we had, of course, a good-sized task force off the coast of Cuba, blockading Cuba to keep from weapons of war being furnished to Castro by his friends in Russia. So they were part of the Cuban blockade, refueling the ships in that task force.
Wow, that's so cool, because, I mean, that is a big part of our history.
Oh, yeah.
That was such a big ordeal.
It was kind of an on and off thing. I mean, they were given other assignments at times.
Now, I'm trying to remember, was that technically the start of the Cold War? Or was that?
I think the Cold War basically started pretty much as soon as World War II was finished.
That's good.
Pretty much so.
Good point.
Because of the expansionism of Russia and so forth.
Yeah.
Of course, then you had the Berlin Wall and that sort of thing at a later date. But the Kankakee operated in the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Mediterranean for a number of years in the 60s and even later than that. They also had a couple of other interesting assignments. March 1965, they were part of the recovery unit, the ships that were recovering the capsule from Gemini 3 spaceflight mission.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and I think there's, they were obviously fueling the ships that were doing the recovery and so forth.
Yeah.
And same duty in November of 1966 when they were in the recovery fleet for the Gemini 12 mission as well. But they were. There's lots of data up and down on all the places they were and what they did and so forth.
And
most of it is.
Yeah, and so all this information you got probably from those logs you mentioned earlier, or
no, most of this is from various sorts we have information we have, including, of course, the internet.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And official, stories on the ship itself, when it was commissioned, when it was decommissioned, and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's doing research or something. This is pulling together things from all different sources.
Oh, yeah. I just was curious if some of that information was in those logs you had mentioned.
I'm not sure. I haven't actually gone into the logs because there's a whole shelf of them there.
Yeah, and I would imagine it might be hard to. I would assume that it's handwritten.
I believe they are. Yeah.
So it's probably hard to read some of that handwriting.
I know that Jory, of course, she's out currently with some health problems, but not too long ago she had a question from someone who was trying to get some information, and she was able to go into the logs, and I think she found the information he was looking for.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's useful. We get requests like that all the time in the museum for various things.
Yeah. I suppose this would take a lot of research, but maybe you know this already. It would be interesting to find out if anyone from Kankakee wound up on the U.S. Kankakee.
We probably could track that down. That's a good, interesting possibility.
Yeah.
The USS Kankakee ended its official life in 1973. On January 1, 1973, it ended active service, and she was sold for scrap on April 1, 1976. So that was the end of the USS Kankakee and the end of the name Kankakee in a naval ship.
Yeah, they never reused it.
Never had another one. I don't know whether they changed the categories or what, but however, it's not the only ship with the name Kankakee.
Oh.
In fact, there have been on and off ships with the name of Kankakee going all the way back to the Civil War.
Wow.
It's something that boggled my mind.
In the Navy or just in general?
The United States Coast Guard.
Okay.
Or actually, originally, September 1863. And of course, we were in a major battle, and we're trying to make sure that the Confederacy was not being resupplied by ship from England and various other places. So we had a series of armed ships known as revenue cutters that were run by what became the Coast Guard in later years. The revenue cutter Kankakee was, as I say, was active in 1863. I think that's when it first went on duty. And it was a hybrid. It was both a sailing ship and a steam-driven ship. It had both a steam engine and sails. Pretty decently sized, 138 feet long, and a crew of 41 sailors or Coast Guardsmen. And it was part of the blockade of southern ports during the Civil War.
And how did it get the name of Kankakee?
No information on it, just that it was. I went through some of the Coast Guard records and just found that it was there and what it was, but who knows? Maybe there was some congressman somewhere that.
I mean, that could very well be.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was decommissioned in 1867 after the war, but was not scrapped immediately. It was sold to Japan for its navy.
Wow. So that's probably the first ship that we could find that was named after Kankakee then.
I would think so, yeah. I can't find any earlier. And of course, I couldn't find any record of any naval ship, U.S. Navy ship. The second vessel with the name of Kankakee, actually USCGS Kankakee, which is United States Coast Guard cutter, was launched at Dubuque, Iowa in 1919. You think of the Coast Guard, you don't think of middle of the country.
No, I don't think of Dubuque, Iowa. Would that been along the Mississippi?
Yes, the Mississippi.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, the Coast Guard is, of course, very active in the Mississippi, and they are in the Great Lakes. There's, of course, a Coast Guard station in Chicago, right, which friends of mine who went into the Coast Guard when they were, referred to them as Dooney stations. But the Kankakee was, the USCGS Kankakee was built in Dubuque, Iowa, went into service in 1919, and it was a steam-driven steel sternwheel boat, and it was 182 feet in length, so it was bigger than the one from the 1860s.
Yeah, that'd be a big boat to see on the Mississippi.
Pretty good sized, yeah. And it was mostly involved in flood relief and rescue work for its period of life in the upper Mississippi. That's, of course, Dubuque and so forth. Yeah, there's a good-sized presence of internal waterways that are administered by the Coast Guard. It was sold in 1936 and probably cut up for scrap. There was no record of what it was. And then currently there is a Kankakee.
Oh, there is.
USCGS Kankakee is based in Memphis, Tennessee, and it maintains buoys and other navigational aids. It was built in New Orleans and commissioned in 1990. It's quite a bit smaller than the other one, 75 feet in length.
Oh, yeah, that isn't very big.
But it
compared
is
to the
paired
others.
up with a barge, a good-sized barge that has a crane on it that is used in doing the taking buoys, putting buoys in, taking buoys out, and maintaining these sorts of things.
Huh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So I see, I guess it makes sense for the Coast Guard to have ships with,
Names
or
of
boats,
rivers.
Kankakee, just because they're working in the rivers and the big lakes and things like that. But that's cool to know that there's still one that exists,
Yes.
but in the Coast Guard.
Yeah, so we actually have a history of that name being applied to ships from the Civil War till today.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I was thinking about is, I'm assuming, going back to the USS Kankakee, now, it's fueling up these ships during World War II, the battleships.
Right.
Do those fuel ships kind of hang around, or do they fuel these things up and they get the hell out? I mean, do you know what?
Hard to say. I would say no, because of if there was a very active, like some of the really active battles where you had 100 ships between the two sides throwing lead around at each other, I have the feeling they probably would have backed off some, because they certainly would not want to suffer a hit.
You don't want to get hit, yeah. So I would think they would go, I'm not sure where they would go, but they would leave.
They generally, though, would have been, I think, and I'm not a Navy man, so I'm not sure, but I think they would have generally been part of the formation of ships, because the ships generally, maintain a certain patterns of organizations for the fleet or for the task force and so forth, that with usually I think the destroyers out on the edges and the capital ships closer to the middle and so forth. But when you're in the middle of a hot war battle, I have the feeling that takes some different rules and so forth. But I would think if I were the captain of the USS Kankakee, I would probably, if I had the option, back off some and wait to refuel the ships that were left after the battle.
Yeah, because they could definitely be a target, to get rid of their fuel or just to make a big explosion, all the above.
That's right.
So
I don't have any information on how many fleet oilers there were, but there were certainly a lot of them, because there were Atlantic and Pacific theaters of war and so forth.
Yeah.
And of course, you always have and currently have a worldwide presence of U.S. Navy ships, and they need to be fueled.
Right.
But,
yeah. And I would think, at least in that time, I don't know how it works now, but the battleships, they're not necessarily going to harbor all the time.
Oh no,
They're staying out. So, the oil tank or the oil tankers have to come out to them and keep giving them fuel.
Right.
So the oil tanker, if anything, is going to land more often than the other.
I think you're right. I think generally speaking, especially during the heat of the war itself, that the larger ships, or most of the ships, they were busy in the wide open ocean. Were not returning to port for anything except possibly reprovisioning, although maybe that was done by remote also. But the tankers, even though they had huge capacity, I'm sure had to recycle back to some place to fill their tanks.
Oh, right, absolutely.
And so it's a pretty interesting story, really.
Yeah. We touched on the museum has the wheel from the U.S. Kankakee. And there's a couple other things, and I can't remember if you mentioned them earlier or not, but there's some other USS Kankakee.
It's a life buoy, the donut with the name on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe there are several other items, but I don't recall offhand, but they are obviously items from that ship.
Well, you can go to the museum and you can take a picture.
That's right.
with yourself on the wheel. So, is there anything else you want to add about U.S. Kankakee or?
No, I think that probably, we pretty well mined out the topic on USS Kankakee, but of course the museum has many, many different areas of interest to people.
Yes.
In addition, of course, to our military exhibit, we have the George Gray Barnard's sculpture exhibit, an entire gallery devoted to that. We have a large sports gallery. Originally, it was a century of sports, 1900 to 2000, but that's been brought up to date. I think it's still called that, but we've been bringing it up to date with some of the later things. Among the other items in there, of course, is information on the years when the Kankakee Little League teams went to the National World Series in Pennsylvania through that. We also have a large gallery called The Story of Kankakee, which is kind of a broad overview of what we are and who we were and who we are now. That pretty much covers most of our galleries, but we have, of course, on the same campus, we have a one-room schoolhouse that was moved there from the Altorf area. And, of course, the Governor Small, the Dr. Eyal Small historic mansion, which is part of the Governor Small Memorial Park.
Yes.
And that is one of the oldest houses in Kankakee. It was the first 4 rooms of it were built in 1855.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, and people who might be interested in visiting the museum, we're open from 9 in the morning until 5 at night on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, and sometimes open for special events such as our annual Rhubarb Festival, which was last week. But there's plenty to see and do there. And, of course, our French Heritage Museum downtown, which is at Indiana Avenue and Oak Street in an 1860s stone barn.
Mm-hmm.
That's currently undergoing some work, but I believe it's open. I'm not sure whether they've had a chance to open it up yet. We've been rebuilding the cupola on top of the building, and it required them to install all this elaborate scaffolding so that the workers could be up there, but it's been something that's needed for quite some time because we had some roof leaks and things that needed to be fixed. And French Heritage Museum is also a unique museum. We have people from all over the world coming there. A lot of people from French Canada, especially.
Yes.
Because it honors the large contingent of our population here in this area who came here from French Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's kind of a wrap-up of what's going on.
Yeah, and you can always keep up to date, KankakeeCountyMuseum.com. There's also Facebook and Instagram. You can follow at Kankakee County Museum to stay up to date on all the different events and exhibits that are coming to either museum, actually. So, Jack Clacy, thank you so much again. And, of course, always want to mention people can check out your weekly column in the Daily Journal and the weekend edition of the paper. It's always a treat to read those columns.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I always enjoy them. And it's something that I think a lot of us appreciate. So thank you for that, Jack.
Thank you. We appreciate people visiting our facilities and learning about their hometowns.
Yes,
or
absolutely.
The towns they're visiting.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Thank you so much, Jack.
Okay.
That concludes this episode of Kankakee Podcast. I'm Jake Lamore. Thank you so much for listening. Please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Kankakee Podcast. Shout out to Stephanie Vanderweide for supporting the show each month through Patreon. If you want your name announced on a future episode, you can sign up at patreon.com/Kankakee Podcast. Special thanks to our sponsors, Chicago Dough Company, Noble Dairy Queen Stores, Frank's Appliance Center and Sleep Source, Pigosh Engineering, King Music, Little Me Studio, Taco John's, D. Westfall Jewelers, and Edward Jones Financial Advisor Adam Elroy. Kankakee Podcast is produced by the fine team at Pathfinder, a full-service marketing agency in downtown Kankakee. Learn more at yourpathfinder.io. Our theme song is by Lupe Carroll.
This river